I stood frozen on the porch of our beachside home, my fingers clenched around the phone, so tight they ached. My father's voice was calm, too calm, as he said the words that shattered everything Ryan and I had built. "Emily, we sold the beach house." My throat closed. I thought I'd misheard him. "What do you mean sold?" The silence on the other end was heavy, like he knew exactly what he'd done. "Madison's in trouble again. This time it's serious. She owes over $200,000. We didn't have a choice. My knees buckled. I had to grab the railing to keep from falling. That house wasn't just property. It was the dream Ryan and I spent 7 years building with nothing but grit, late nights, and faith in each other. We poured our hearts into that place. Every board, every beam carried our story, and he just gave it away without even telling us, without our consent. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a whisper. "You forged our signatures, didn't you?" He hesitated, then finally said, "We did what we had to do. You barely even used the house. Madison's life is at stake. What's more important than that?" I could feel heat rising to my face, rage, betrayal, heartbreak all crashing together. My voice shook. "You didn't ask. You didn't even tell us. You stole from us for her." Again. All I heard in return was, "We thought you'd understand. Family helps each other." Family. That word used to mean something to me, but right then it felt like a knife. I looked out toward the waves crashing against the shore. The same waves Ryan and I had surfed together on the day we first decided this house would be our legacy. Now it was gone. All because my parents had once again risked everything to save the one person who never faced consequences for anything. And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't just another Madison disaster. This was the last straw. I wasn't surprised that my parents chose Madison over me, again, because deep down, they always had. When I was 5, I got a shiny red tricycle for my birthday. I remember squealing, circling it like it was treasure, my tiny hands, gripping the handlebars like I'd just discovered freedom. It was the first gift I could remember wanting, really wanting. 2 days later, it was gone. Madison had taken it. She was only 3 then, still stumbling over her own feet. But the moment she pointed at that trike and said, "Mine, my fate was sealed. Let her have it, Emily. You're the big sister," Mom had said, not unkindly, but firmly. I protested, but it was my birthday, and I remember Dad kneeling beside me, brushing my hair behind my ear, whispering, "That's what big sisters do. You give, you protect." That was the first time I felt invisible. It wouldn't be the last. When I started kindergarten, Grandma mailed me a glittery unicorn pencil case. I loved that thing. It zipped all the way around and had tiny compartments for my crayons. I showed it off for exactly 3 days before Madison saw it, pouted and cried, until Mom took it and handed it to her. "She's still young, sweetie," Mom said. "You can use your old one." Madison doesn't understand sharing yet. But I did. I understood it meant I had to shrink quietly, politely, so she could take up more space. By the time I was 9, I stopped asking for anything fancy. At school, I watched kids sign up for dance classes, soccer leagues, piano lessons. I asked once, just once, if I could take swimming. I loved the water even then. But Mom didn't even look up from the sink when she said, "We already enrolled Madison in ballet and piano. Maybe next year, okay?" Next year never came. The only extracurricular I had was helping Madison study. I still remember trying to finish my math homework in the kitchen while she wailed over a vocabulary test. Dad looked at me and said, "Emily, she needs help. You can do your work later." Later meant never. Every recital, every birthday, every report card. She was always the main event. I remember the third grade spelling bee. I practiced for weeks, won first place. Came home with a small trophy I couldn't wait to show them. But that same morning, Madison had tripped during recess and scraped her knee. That evening, Dad barely looked at my award. He just said, "Be gentle, she had a rough day." I ended up putting the trophy under my bed. When I ran the fastest mile in gym class, Madison cried during the parent-teacher picnic, so Mom and Dad left early. When I got selected to represent my class in the state science fair, they said they couldn't take the time off work to come. But somehow they always found time for Madison's ballet competitions, school plays, and art exhibitions. Even at Christmas, the difference was clear. Madison got an iPad one year. I got notebooks and socks. Mom called them practical. In middle school, I stopped telling them about my achievements altogether. Why bother? They didn't care when I made student council, didn't react when I won the essay contest, didn't attend my school's open house, even when I was chosen to give the welcome speech. Meanwhile, if Madison got a B+ instead of an A, the house turned into a crisis center. She was always sensitive, fragile. Not as tough as you, Emily. By high school, I learned to stay out of the way. I worked part-time, saved money, and focused on getting out. Out of that house, out of that shadow. College was my ticket. I spent every night poring over textbooks, filling out applications, chasing scholarships like my life depended on it, because in a way it did. When I finally got into my dream school, University of Washington, I expected just for a second that maybe this time they'd be proud. But when I told them, Mom barely glanced up from the stove. "That's nice. Did you hear Madison made the honor roll?" That night, I came home to a dinner table covered in Madison's favorite foods. They weren't celebrating me. They didn't even mention it. I didn't eat. In their eyes, Madison was the star. I was the assistant. And I was tired. By the time I walked across that graduation stage 4 years later, I didn't even bother inviting them. They probably wouldn't have come anyway. But none of that hurt as much as hearing my dad's voice that day. On the phone, calm, collected, as if he hadn't just committed fraud. As if he hadn't just taken everything I built with Ryan and tossed it aside like it meant nothing. Like I meant nothing. But I wasn't that invisible little girl anymore. I had changed, and this time I was done being quiet. I didn't plan to fall in love the day I nearly drowned. But that's how it started. It was the first week of freshman year, and I had finally escaped Oregon. I was on the coast of Santa Cruz, still figuring out how to breathe on my own for the first time. No parents, no Madison, just me and the ocean. A flyer caught my eye outside the student rec center, windsurfing club. No experience needed, all welcome. Something about it pulled me in. I'd always loved the water, maybe because it was the one place where no one talked over me. I showed up that Saturday in worn-out sneakers and a borrowed wetsuit, completely clueless but determined. The Pacific was wild that day, the wind sharp, the waves unkind. I fell, over and over. Salt water burned my eyes, my throat, my pride. I must have flipped that board a dozen times before someone finally yelled from the shore, "You're fighting the water too hard." I looked up, squinting against the sun, and saw him. Ryan Cooper, club captain, senior, built like he'd been carved from surfboard wax and salt air. But it wasn't his body that struck me, it was his smile. He wasn't mocking me, he wasn't annoyed, he was patient. "Everyone wipes out." At first, he said, jogging into the waves, holding out his hand. I fell flat on my face for weeks. "You're doing great." Those words, I didn't realize how much I needed to hear them. He helped me up, showed me how to shift my weight, how to read the wind, how not to panic when I lost control. And slowly, over the next few weeks, I got better, stronger, freer, and we got closer. Ryan had a calm presence, like standing in the eye of a storm. He listened, really listened. He asked me what I wanted out of life and waited for the answer. We spent long afternoons out on the water, long nights in late-night diners, talking about dreams, mistakes, family. He was the first person who saw me, not as Madison's sister, not as the good girl, just Emily. A few months later, we were inseparable. He taught me how to drive stick. I taught him how to budget on 2 part-time jobs and a prayer. We built our little world, simple, messy, full of laughter and ramen noodles. When I graduated, I was offered a job in corporate marketing. Safe, solid, predictable. But Ryan had another idea. Why don't we start something ourselves? I laughed. Like what, we're broke, so we get creative. We stayed up for weeks sketching out plans on napkins, building a business idea from scratch. A company that would import high-quality water sports gear equipment Ryan had tested during competitions and sell it across the U.S. with a focus on eco-conscious design. It sounded insane. We were 20-somethings with no business degrees and a combined bank account that could barely cover rent. But we were hungry and we believed in it. Ryan borrowed $5,000 from his uncle. I picked up 2 extra shifts at the Cafe One as a night janitor on campus. We lived off bulk rice, black coffee, and blind faith. Our first office was a shoebox apartment above a laundromat. The building shook every time the dryers went into spin cycle. We shared a desk made of 2 cinder blocks and a door we found on the curb. This is the starting line, Ryan said that first night, popping open a $4 bottle of sparkling wine. Let's make it count. We faced rejection everywhere. You're too young. No one's heard of you. Come back when you've got real numbers. Still, we kept showing up at trade shows, at tournaments on docks, anywhere someone might listen. We talked to athletes, distributors, small retailers. We built a brand out of our own sweat and stories. Then came the break. At a coastal sports expo in Florida, we met a small manufacturer from Australia, a family-run outfit trying to enter the U.S. market. They were honest, scrappy, just like us. We clicked. They gave us a shot, an exclusive distributor contract for the West Coast. We couldn't believe it. That night, back in our tiny apartment, we didn't sleep. We danced, we cried, we dreamed louder than we ever had before. From there, things started to move, slowly but surely. We reinvested every dollar, expanded our product line, hired our first part-time assistant, Amanda, who showed up with a resume printed on neon pink paper and ended up becoming our operations manager. Within 3 years, we'd outgrown the apartment, moved into a real warehouse, got featured in a niche sports magazine. Our logo showed up at local beach competitions. We were still nobodies in the corporate world, but in our corner of it, we were building something that mattered. Then one day on a whim, we drove along the coastline just south of Monterey. We saw a house. It was old, weathered, sitting on a bluff half hidden behind wildflowers and wind-worn trees. But the moment we saw the view, the ocean stretching endlessly below us, we knew. This is the one, Ryan whispered, fingers laced with mine. I didn't even have to answer. I felt the same thing. We poured everything into it, every extra cent, every weekend. We sanded the floors by hand, repainted the porch, installed solar panels, struggled through YouTube plumbing tutorials, and argued over tile choices. But every bit of that house carried our fingerprints, our fights, our laughter, our quiet mornings and late-night brainstorming sessions. It was ours in every way. One night, after a long day of sanding cabinets, we collapsed on the back deck with 2 beers and a shared blanket. The stars blinked overhead. The ocean whispered below. Ryan turned to me and said, "Let's grow old here." And I believed we would. That house wasn't just our home. It was proof. Proof that you didn't need a perfect family or a padded safety net. You just needed the right person and the courage to keep going. But dreams are fragile things, especially when the people you left behind can't stand to see you fly without them. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Monterey coastline when my phone rang. I had just returned from a business trip across Southeast Asia, a grueling 10-day stretch of client meetings, long-haul flights, and hotel rooms that all blurred into each other. I was exhausted, jet-lagged, and craving a quiet weekend in the home Ryan and I had built with our bare hands. I was still in my pajamas, coffee brewing in the kitchen, when I saw the caller ID. "Dad," I hesitated. That alone should have told me something was off. He rarely called me directly unless it was about Madison. I answered, "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" There was a pause too long. Then came his voice, strained, but trying to sound casual. "Emily, we need to talk. I could feel it. Something was wrong. What's going on?" He cleared his throat like he was about to read from a script. "It's about the beach house." My stomach dropped. "What about it?" Another pause, then the sentence that knocked the air out of my lungs. "We've already sold it. The ownership transfer happens next month." I blinked, not understanding. "Sold it." "What are you talking about?" I whispered. "You don't own it." "Ryan and I do. You can't just—" "Madison's in trouble again," he interrupted. "It's serious this time. She got caught up in a bad investment deal. She owes over $200,000. If we don't help, the debt collectors will." I dropped into a chair, my vision blurred for a second. "You sold our house." Emily listened without telling us, without even asking. The tremble in my voice gave way to fury. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to put the phone on speaker just to hold it. "We needed to act fast," he said. "And we already had your signature on file from the initial paperwork. We just reused the documents." There it was, the thing I feared the moment I heard the word sold. "They forged our signatures." My jaw clenched. The anger rose like a tide I couldn't control. "That's illegal," I said flatly. "It's called fraud." There was silence on the line, then a shaky exhale. "We didn't mean to hurt anyone. It was just, Madison needs help. You barely even stay there anymore. She's your sister Emily. Don't you think her life is more important than a house? That house isn't just a house," I snapped. "It's everything Ryan and I built. It's our dream. It's ours, and you stole it for her." Again, I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Could hear the waves crashing just outside the window. The same waves that lulled us to sleep, that carried our laughter, that held our memories. And now, some stranger was going to own that, because Madison messed up, again. Because no matter how many times she burned everything down, my parents were always there to hand her more matches. "You forged legal documents," I repeated. "I don't care what your reason was. I'm calling the police." He gasped. "Emily, don't be ridiculous. This is a family matter." "No," I said coldly. "This is a crime." I hung up, and for a moment all I could hear was the wind outside and the sound of my own breath breaking apart. I didn't cry, not yet. There was too much fury holding the tears back. Within the hour, I contacted a lawyer and the police. I sent them photos of the documents, including the copy Ryan and I had kept safely stored with our original signatures. Nothing like the ones used in the fake sale agreement. That evening, Ryan came straight from the office. His face was pale, jaw tight. I spoke with the buyers, he said. Turns out one of them was a guy I went to college with. I told him everything. He said once they saw how rushed the sale was, and after hearing your father's story, they started to have doubts. They've backed out. I exhaled so hard I nearly collapsed. It's not over, he added. The police are involved now. They're looking into your parents' actions. That night we didn't eat. We sat on the deck, holding hands in silence, staring out at the sea like it might have the answers. But the only thing it offered was more quiet. The investigation moved fast. Within days, authorities uncovered forged signatures, bank transfers, and real estate forms falsified with fake notary stamps. They even discovered my mother had spread false rumors to our neighbors claiming Ryan and I were moving abroad and needed to sell quickly. They're in trouble, our attorney said, shaking his head. This wasn't impulsive. They planned this carefully. I didn't respond. I couldn't, because my parents hadn't just tried to steal a house. They had betrayed everything I thought they still respected about me, my autonomy, my work, my life with Ryan. They were willing to destroy it all for Madison, and she wasn't even surprised. When she finally called, it was to scream. How could you do this, she cried, calling the police on our parents. That's disgusting. You're heartless. I didn't yell back. I just said quietly. They tried to steal our home. That's a felony. But it's me. Emily, I'm drowning. I need help. Then learn how to swim, I said and hung up. The days that followed were brutal. I found out that Madison had racked up debt before more than we knew. A student loan she used on designer bags, a tuition fund she blew on Vegas weekends, an ex-boyfriend who convinced her to invest in crypto with money she didn't have. Each time my parents swooped in, paid it off, coddled her, told her the world was cruel and she was just too soft for it. Meanwhile, they told me to be strong, to settle, to take care of her when they were gone. Now they had nearly destroyed everything Ryan and I built, and I was done. I didn't answer when Mom called sobbing, didn't reply to Dad's long emails begging me to reconsider, didn't open the letter they mailed me with "We're sorry" scribbled across the envelope. I forwarded all of it to the police, because love doesn't mean looking the other way. Love doesn't mean letting people walk all over you in the name of family. That's not love, that's sacrifice. And I was finished bleeding. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was realizing that no one else seemed to think it was wrong. The week after I reported my parents, my phone became a war zone. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years were suddenly dialing in with concerned voices and shallow sympathy, thinly veiled attempts to manipulate me into dropping the charges. Emily, they're your parents. They were just trying to help your sister. You're overreacting. You really want to drag your family through court. Every time the same line repeated, like a curse, you were the older one. You should understand. And that was the root of it, wasn't it? I had spent my whole life being told to understand, to sacrifice, to be responsible, to stay quiet. But no one ever asked Madison to understand anything. She didn't call to apologize. She didn't even pretend to be sorry. Instead, 3 days after the police opened a formal investigation, she messaged me on Instagram of all places. A simple sentence, "I hope you're happy. You destroyed everything." I didn't reply, but I read it over and over. She had no idea what she had destroyed, because she had never built anything in her life. While I was working 3 jobs attending night classes, stitching together a future from scraps, Madison was floating through life like it owed her something. And every time she crashed, Mom and Dad were there to soften the landing. They'd drained their retirement fund paying off her credit cards, sold the last piece of land Grandpa left us to cover her failed Etsy boutique. And now they had tried to steal from me. I remember pacing the hallway of our warehouse office, phone in hand, breathing hard as the police detective briefed me. "They forged both your signature and Ryan's. It was well organized. They fabricated a story to the real estate agent, told them you two were relocating abroad. They planned this for months." My mouth went dry. Months, while I was hosting product showcases in Bali and speaking at environmental sustainability panels, my parents were plotting to erase me. Worse, they didn't even see it that way. The detective added something else. That during questioning, my mother had cried. Not because of what she'd done, but because she feared how it would look to others. She told them she was forced into it, that Emily never helps Madison. She's always cold. She's changed. She was right about that. I had changed. I stopped believing that love meant allowing yourself to be hurt over and over again. I stopped believing that silence was strength, and I stopped pretending that family meant immunity from consequences. But it didn't make any of it easier. One night, after a long day at work, I was grocery shopping when I saw her. My mother, in the frozen food aisle of a discount supermarket. She didn't see me at first. She was hunched over her frame, thinner than I remembered. Her basket was filled with dented cans, expired bread clearance labels peeling off. When our eyes met, her expression shifted from shock to shame. And then she turned away, quickly, quietly, like I was the one who had done something wrong. I didn't chase her. I just stood there paralyzed, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, my heart beating in my throat. I wanted to feel vindicated, but all I felt was tired. Not long after I got an email from Madison. The subject line was just "please." Inside she wrote, "I know I've made mistakes, but I need help. I'm drowning. If you could just lend me $50,000, I swear I can fix this. I have an opportunity. It's different this time. Please, Emily, I have no one else. No apology, no ownership, just another request, another fire she expected me to put out." I closed the email, took a breath, and sent her a list of nonprofit debt counselors' financial literacy programs and rehabilitation services. Then I blocked her. Ryan found me on the deck that night, staring out at the sea, my fingers numb. He didn't say anything at first. He just wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat beside me. Finally, he whispered, "You don't have to carry their choices anymore." And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. The police case went public 3 weeks later. A local news outlet picked it up. Retired couple under investigation for forgery fraud in property scheme involving daughter. The headlines made my stomach turn, not because they were inaccurate, but because they felt so surreal. This wasn't just my family anymore. It was a spectacle. I received angry texts from distant cousins. One of them even wrote, "Couldn't you have just let it go? What's one house? One house." That house was every 3 a.m., where Ryan and I drafted business plans on the kitchen floor. It was every Christmas morning we spent laughing over burnt pancakes. It was where I cried the day my first international shipment got canceled, and Ryan built me a fort out of beach towels to cheer me up. That house was our proof that we'd made it, that we weren't who they said we'd be, and they tried to erase it like it meant nothing. So no, I couldn't let it go. My parents were sentenced 6 months later. Suspended sentence, no jail time, but a permanent mark on their records and a stain on whatever was left of our family. I never read the apology letters they sent after the sentencing. I shredded them without opening a single one, because sometimes forgiveness isn't healing. Sometimes it's a loophole for repeat offenders, and I was done letting them walk through it. The fallout was quiet but brutal. Their family home was sold. My father took a night shift job as a parking lot security guard. My mother juggled 3 minimum wage jobs, packing at a warehouse, in the morning cashiering during the day, and working at a 24-hour diner at night. Neighbors talked. She's lost so much weight. I heard they live in a tiny apartment now just outside Salinas. Madison stayed the same. According to one of her former friends, she started dating a guy from some nightclub scene, told people she had another investment opportunity that was definitely going to work this time. She hadn't changed, and honestly, neither had my parents. They still answered her calls, still tried to scrape together money they didn't have, still excused her recklessness with the same tired phrase, "She's not strong like Emily. She needs us." I don't think they ever realized that they were the reason she never grew up. They called it love, but it was poison, sweet and slow, and devastating. Ryan and I watched it all from afar. Sometimes I'd get quiet in the evenings, staring out the window, wondering how it all spiraled so far. Ryan would sense it. Without a word, he'd pour me a glass of wine, sit beside me, and just be there. We didn't talk about them much anymore. Because the truth is, I hadn't just lost trust. I'd lost something deeper. The idea that blood meant safety, that parents meant protection, that family meant home. I'd outgrown that fairy tale, and it hurt, but it also freed me. Because when you finally stop waiting for people to become who they should have been, you can start becoming who you were always meant to be. The final straw didn't come with a bang. It came with a single sentence, plain small, buried in an email I almost deleted without reading. "Margaret, lend me $50,000. I promise I can turn everything around." She didn't even say hi, didn't ask how I was. No remorse, no apology. Just another desperate request from a sister who still believed the world owed her another bailout. But this time, there was no world left. Madison had burned through everything: my parents' savings, their retirement, their health, their reputation, and nearly the last thing I had that was mine. She thought the cycle could repeat again, that I would be the next safety net. But I was done being the net. I stared at that message for a long time, sitting alone at my desk in the office Ryan and I had built from scratch. Sunlight spilled in through the window, casting shadows across the floorboards we laid ourselves. Every corner of that space reminded me of who I'd become, not because of them, but in spite of them. And Madison, she hadn't changed at all. According to one of Ryan's friends from town, she was still bouncing from man to man, job to job, story to story. The most recent one, a nightclub promoter named Vince, who had convinced her to invest in a chain of pop-up speakeasies across the Southwest. She believed him, of course. Just like she believed the crypto guy, the skincare MLM, the influencer coaching platform, the travel blog agency that went bankrupt in 3 weeks. And every time the house of cards fell, my parents ran to catch her. Even after everything, even after court, I heard from a neighbor that my father, now pushing 70, was working security night shifts without a single day off. Mom was still juggling her triple job routine, dragging herself from the warehouse to the diner like a ghost. They were exhausted, but still clinging to Madison, still defending her. "She's trying her best," Mom told a relative during a grocery store run. "She just needs one good break." No one ever said that about me. I was just expected to be fine. They didn't call to ask how the business was, didn't check if I was sleeping, didn't wonder if the lawsuit had taken anything from me beyond time and money. I had watched my parents throw themselves into Madison's wreckage for over a decade, picking up pieces of a life she never tried to fix herself. But now, the pieces were cutting through them, drawing blood, and they still didn't stop. I could have stepped in. That's what everyone wanted. Relatives called, messaged, showed up in my inbox like ghosts from family barbecues I barely remembered. "They're suffering, Emily. You have the means. Just help them out this once." I had already given them more than they ever deserved. I gave them silence when they ignored me. I gave them respect when they chose favoritism. I gave them years of patience, even when I was crumbling inside. This time I gave them boundaries. I replied to Madison's email with a single message. "No, please seek help through professional channels. I've included some below." Then I listed nonprofits' mental health programs and financial literacy centers. Then I hit send. Then I blocked her. The ache in my chest wasn't pride, it was grief. Not just for what I'd lost, but for the version of me that still wanted to believe things could be different. She had died somewhere between the courtroom and the last time I saw my mother in that supermarket aisle. A few days later, I got a voicemail from my Aunt Dad's older sister. I let it go to spam, but the transcription popped up on my screen. "He collapsed at work, overexertion. He's okay, but it's serious. Don't you care?" I sat with that message for hours, the phone face down on the table. I did care. I just couldn't keep carrying the guilt of everyone else's choices. Ryan found me in the kitchen that night, making tea with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He didn't ask questions, just wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." And in that moment, I knew I couldn't go back. A few weeks passed. The texts stopped. The calls faded. The world moved on. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the silence after a funeral. Not for a person, but for a connection I had spent years trying to keep alive. Sometimes I wondered if I should feel guilty, if walking away made me heartless. But guilt is a tricky thing. It feels like love if you've been conditioned to believe suffering is your role in the story. I wasn't heartless. I was healing. And healing meant saying no. No to more lies. No to more manipulation. No to being the emotional landfill for a family that only showed up when they needed something. That winter, Ryan and I went back to the beach house for the first time in months. The sky was overcast and the air had that biting edge that made your breath visible. We lit a fire, made cocoa, put on old records, and for the first time in what felt like years, I breathed. We stood on the back deck, staring at the ocean that had always been there no matter how chaotic everything else became. "You okay?" Ryan asked. I nodded. "Better than I've been in a long time." He reached for my hand. "You know, we built this, not them, not anyone else. Us, and no one can take that away from us again." He was right. The world outside that house could burn, but here on this bluff, surrounded by salt air and silence, I was safe. It took losing everything to finally understand that family isn't a birthright. It's a choice, and I chose peace. I chose truth. I chose myself. I didn't know what the future held for my parents or Madison, but I knew this: I wouldn't be part of the cycle anymore. Not because I didn't love them, but because I finally loved myself more. The story could have ended there, quiet, final. But pain has a way of echoing, especially when the world's watching. The first new twist came without warning. One morning, Ryan burst into my office holding his phone. His face was flushed, brows furrowed. "Emily, have you seen this?" I took the phone from his hand and saw a TikTok video playing. A woman, someone I didn't recognize, was speaking directly into the camera with an expression somewhere between pity and disgust. So apparently there's this woman who called the cops on her own elderly parents over a house. I don't know, guys, but that seems heartless no matter what they did. I blinked. The comment section was a mess of assumptions and armchair ethics. Wow, entitled much. That house probably wasn't even hers. Family's family. You don't betray blood like that. There were thousands of views, tens of thousands, and more videos began popping up, people reacting, stitching, speculating. A story that was once private had mutated into internet fodder. They didn't even know my name, but they all had opinions. I scrolled through the comments like I was reading a version of my own life, written by strangers who didn't care whether it was true. My chest tightened. "This isn't real," I whispered. "They don't know me." But it didn't matter. Social media didn't wait for facts. It feasted on drama. Eventually, a local reporter picked up the online outrage and contacted me for a comment. I ignored it at first. I wanted it to disappear. But silence didn't help me before, and it wasn't going to help now. So I wrote. I sat down in front of my laptop and poured my truth into a letter, not defensive, not angry, just honest. I posted it to our business website, then shared it to our social platforms. I didn't call the police on my parents because I hate them. I did it because they forged my name to sell the home I built with the man I love. I did it because protecting your peace sometimes means protecting your property, your name, your dignity, even when the threat comes from the people who raised you. If speaking up makes me heartless, then maybe too many of us have been taught that silence is love, but I know better now. And I'm not sorry for drawing a line. The response overwhelming. Messages flooded in, not just from friends or clients, but strangers. People who had been used by their families, manipulated, robbed of their voice in the name of love. Women wrote that they felt seen. Men admitted they cried. One girl said, "Your story gave me the strength to say no to my mom for the first time in my life." It was the first time I realized this wasn't just my story. It was ours, all of us who had been told to stay quiet, to keep the peace, to be the bigger person even when we were bleeding. And just like that, something in me shifted. I wasn't hiding anymore, but the second twist, that one came from Ryan. It was late March, the air was just starting to warm, and the first signs of spring were showing along the coast. He came home from a meeting, tossed his keys in the bowl by the door, and said, "I've been thinking." I looked up from my laptop. "Uh-oh," he laughed. "What if we opened up the house to what another lawsuit?" "No," he said, "to something good, something bigger than us." He sat beside me, his voice soft but certain. "We always said this place held our memories, but maybe it can hold more. What if we turned it into a place for kids like us? The ones who were overlooked, the ones who never got the attention, the support, the chance to breathe." I stared at him, heart aching in the best way. Like a retreat, like a sanctuary, he said. We teach them to surf. We teach them to trust the waves. We show them what's possible when someone believes in them. The idea lit something inside me, a new kind of purpose. We reached out to a few local nonprofits, built a small program, designed a pilot for the summer 12 kids from underserved backgrounds, coming in for a week-long experience they'd never forget. When the first group arrived, I stood on the porch watching the vans pull in. I saw nervous eyes, unsure feet, stepping out onto unfamiliar ground. And I remembered being that girl, scared, quiet, invisible, until someone reached for my hand and said, "You belong here." That week was chaos, in the best way, salt in the airboards under arms. Laughter so loud it echoed into the night. One girl, Jasmine, stood out. She barely spoke the first 2 days. But on the third morning, I found her standing on the deck, alone watching the ocean. "You surf?" I asked. She shook her head, too scared. I smiled. "Me too. The first time I thought I'd drown." She blinked. "You?" "Yeah. But someone believed I could do it, so I did." That afternoon, she stood up on her board for the first time. Wobbly, wide-eyed, glorious. I wept, because this was what healing looked like. Not in courtrooms, not in silence, but in second chances we give to others once we've finally given them to ourselves. We called the program Wave Back, because it's what I wish someone had told me years ago. You don't have to let the current carry you forever. You can ride it, you can face it, you can wave back. That summer, our beach house became more than our dream. It became a dream for others, too. And for the first time, everything felt exactly where it was meant to be. The waves don't ask who you are before they pull you under. They don't care if you were the favorite child or the forgotten one. They don't care if you grew up loved, neglected, praised, or passed over. They simply meet you where you are, raw, shaking, trying to stand. And they test you. That's what the ocean taught me. Not to be fearless, but to be steady. Not to avoid the fall, but to rise again after the crash. And in many ways, that's what this entire story has been about. When I was younger, I thought survival meant shrinking. Being good, being quiet, not making waves. I thought if I gave enough, if I stayed small enough, maybe I'd finally earn the kind of love Madison got just by existing. But that kind of love, it was never real. It was conditional, fragile, contingent on me sacrificing myself. And when the time came to protect what mattered most, Ryan, our business, our home, our peace, I chose the one thing I had never chosen before. I chose me. That decision cost me everything I once thought family meant. But it gave me something else, freedom. Not the easy kind you read about in self-help books. The kind that leaves scars. The kind that wakes you up at 3 a.m. The kind that forces you to grow stronger than you ever intended to be. Over the past year, as our program Wave Back grew, I met kids who reminded me so much of myself. Quiet, careful, carrying more weight than their age should allow. One afternoon, a boy named Malik, 12 years old, sweet, sharp, barely spoke a word. All week asked me while drying off his board, "Do you still talk to your parents?" I paused, then answered honestly, "No, and I don't know if I ever will again." He looked away for a moment, then whispered, "I don't talk to mine either." I nodded, heart heavy. "That doesn't mean you're broken," I told him. "It just means you get to build something new." That's a truth I had to live through to understand. You don't owe anyone your peace, not even your family. Especially not your family if they trade your peace for their comfort. People think forgiveness is the ultimate virtue, but sometimes forgiveness is just enabling dressed in a prettier outfit. Sometimes what you really need isn't forgiveness, it's release. To let go, to stop reaching back, to walk forward and trust that you're allowed to keep going even if no one follows. My parents never understood that. Even after everything, even after they lost everything, they still believed love meant control. Still believed Madison would turn it around if they just helped her one more time. But help without accountability isn't love, it's sabotage. And I refuse to sabotage myself anymore. Ryan and I still live in the same house, the one they tried to steal. But now it's more than walls and windows. It's a classroom, a launch pad, a sanctuary for those who never had one. We host kids every season, some from foster homes, some from shelters, some just lost in ways no one has ever noticed. We teach them to ride the waves, not fear them. To get knocked down, spit out, swallowed, and still stand back up. Every time I see one of them find their balance, I remember that I did too. Not on a surfboard, but in life. It wasn't perfect. I stumbled, I questioned myself. I almost gave in to the guilt, but I didn't drown, and that means something. Sometimes I sit on the back porch alone, coffee in hand, staring at the horizon. Not because I'm waiting for something, but because I know now that everything I need is already here. In the peace, in the silence, in the space I finally made for myself. And if I could offer one lesson to anyone listening, to the girl working late in her dorm, the man trying to heal from a mother who never said sorry, the kid quietly wondering if they're too much or not enough, it's this: you are allowed to say no. You are allowed to draw a line. You are allowed to protect your light, even if it means standing alone in the dark for a while. Because healing, it's not loud, it's not cinematic, it's not always tied up with a bow. But it's real, and it starts the moment you stop trying to fix people who don't want to be fixed, and start rebuilding yourself instead. So here I am, not whole in the way fairy tales promise, but honest and free, and finally fully mine.